President, and gentlemen, ladies of the House, standing here with 8 minutes in my hands and at this venerable and rather magnificent institution, I was going to assure you that I belong to the Henry VIII School of Public Speaking, that as Henry VIII said to his wives, I shall not keep you long. But now finding myself the seventh speaker out of 8 in what must already seem a rather long evening to you, I rather feel like Henry VIII's last wife. I more or less know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure how to do it any differently. Let me say with the greatest possible respect, it's a bit rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, maim people for 200 years and then celebrate the fact that they're democratic at the end of it. We were denied democracy, sir. We had to snatch it, seize it from you. With the greatest reluctance, it was conceded in India's case after 150 years of British rule, and that too with limited franchise. The proposition before this House is the principle of owing reparations, not the fine points of how much is owed, to whom it should be paid. The question is there a debt? Does Britain owe reparations? As far as I'm concerned, the ability to acknowledge a wrong that has been done, to simply say sorry, will go a far, far, far longer way than some percentage of GDP in the form of aid. What is required, it seems to me, is accepting the principle that reparations are owed. Personally, I'd be quite happy if it was £1 a year for the next 200 years after the last 200 years of Britain and India. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I always adore Shashi Tharoor for his fabulous English. It was just fun. I was listening to him, but I found his effort on Jallianwala Bagh was something great, and it needs to be acknowledged.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has praised a call by an Indian MP who wants compensation for decades of British colonial rule. He says that the idea reflects the feelings of all patriotic Indians. The Member of Indian Parliament, Shashi Tharoor, gave an emotional speech at Oxford University that's gone viral. Tharoor insisted that for many years his nation's been governed for the benefit of Britain, and that Britain's industrial revolution was in fact based on the deindustrialisation of India. Now he wants reparations to be paid, which some estimate could come close to $3 trillion. Our correspondent in London, Aisa Ali, has the details.
This is a speech given at the Oxford Union, which has lit up the internet, more than 1.5 million views, and it's got the attention of the Indian Prime Minister. And in his speech, Mr. Tharoor, who is an MP in the Indian Parliament, pointed out Britain's long history of colonialism in India, and his own estimate was somewhere in the region of, in today's terms, £50 billion alone just for World War II. And Mr. Tharoor making some really interesting points.
Steve Uncles from the English Democrats Party explained why he doesn't think Britain owes compensation.
We already give India money in foreign aid, and that's totally inappropriate for such a prosperous nation now as India.
Mr. Shashi Tharoor has suggested that India seek an apology from Britain when Prime Minister Theresa May comes visiting for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So do you have any comments on that? Would India be seeking an apology?
All I would say is that India-UK ties, while rooted in history, have a very forward-looking agenda.
At the Oxford Union went viral online after he argued that British rule had destroyed India's future. Let's see a bit of that speech.
The fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression.
We paid for our own oppression. Dr. Tharoor will be joining us very shortly for more on that. Is he right, though? Tommy has been to Liverpool, a port city which thrived on Britain's colonial growth, to find out what people there think.
What do you know about the British Empire?
That Britain rule other countries? Well, not rule. They like help rule other countries.
They're sort of like involved in a lot of the countries around the world.
The British Empire, it's a very imperialistic and in the past very arrogant situation.
We used to have like Australia and India and all those other countries around there, but I don't really know that much about it.
I believe that we brought a lot of freedom to people, a lot of opportunities to countries which probably didn't have them in the past.
The Redcoats marched all over the world and plundered the place. They turned up in places like Africa and said, "We're here," and that was it.
They ruled India at the time, yeah, in the 19th century and 18th century. When they did go there, they brought all the diamonds and everything down here, which Queen got at the moment.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who joins us from Edinburgh this morning. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Your country, India, is tipped as a future superpower. Do you need Britain's money or apologies?
Well, superpower is something else. I'm afraid we're still super poor. So it's a while before we can contemplate superpower status, and I'm not sure we should. But that's another debate. I think as far as the reparations issue is concerned, what I suggested at Oxford was that what was important was the principle that a debt was owed, not a sum of money, because as somebody said in that extract earlier, you can't quantify human suffering. What you can do, of course, is to make a gesture, and I suggested £1 a year for each of the next 200 years to make up for the last 200.
And what would that amount to in your sums?
£200. I mean, the point is, there have been calculations made by people, and they're impossible to fulfill. I mean, somebody has suggested a figure of £3.4 trillion sterling, and which is, you know, far larger than your economy and far larger than you would be able to pay over the next 200 years. So I think that sort of debate is pointless. And the kinds of things I was talking about, the depredations, the dramatic reduction of India's share of global GDP from 23% when the British came to 4% when the British left, the collapse of India's exports from 27% when the British came to 2% when the British left. All of these things, and then the loss of human lives, something like 15 to 29 million Indians died unnecessary deaths in man-made famines during British rule. And the fact is, you cannot put a price on all of this.
Sure.
So reparations in monetary terms is pointless, but the principle of atonement, not just apology, but of atonement is why I suggested £1.
As for being a scam, I don't agree with that at all. I'm proud of our British heritage. I think Britain did extremely well with the British Empire, but I think in 1947, when we pulled out from India and they had their independence, was absolutely right. Of course we made mistakes, but we were never brutal to people who were in the empire, as other
Amritsar massacre,
as other countries were.
And the famines you just spoke about, you're saying that wasn't brutal?
Well, it wasn't all to do with the British. Of course it wasn't.
The Amritsar massacre wasn't to do with the British of 1919.
I don't know.
Have you read what happened after what the British rather arrogantly called the Indian Mutiny, when they asked Hindu and Muslim sepoys to bite on cartridges which contained forbidden animal fats? Their punishment for not doing that was the most appalling acts of genocide by the British, torture of Muslims, wrapping them up in pigskins, putting men in cannon guns and shooting them into the air.
Come back to you. Is this a big issue in India? Do Indian people tell you that this is what they want? They want apologies, and in some cases they would like some form of reparation?
Well, actually, I'm afraid, you know, I'm guilty of having made it one. It wasn't a big issue. This was the topic dreamed up by the bright students at the Oxford Union for their debate. But when my video went viral, it certainly ignited a national debate. And there was overwhelming public sentiment in favour of my argument. And the Prime Minister himself, no less, spoke publicly in support of what I'd had to say. So it did turn out to be a bigger issue. And I suppose the fact that we're discussing it now on the BBC suggests that it has ignited some reflection in various parts of the world. If I could comment on a couple of things that were said earlier. The Amritsar massacre, for example, Jallianwala Bagh, was actually took 1,741 victims, not just the 300 odd you mentioned. And the tragedy is that this was done to a group of completely unarmed protesters who were protesting a particularly iniquitous law imposed by the British commanding officer, General Dyer, which obliged Indians to crawl on all fours through a street. And they'd gathered to protest this absurd instruction when he opened fire and killed so many of them. So it really, this is the kind of brutality we've seen, I'm afraid, the destruction of the textile weavers' livelihoods in Bengal, when many weavers' thumbs were cut off and their looms were smashed so they couldn't continue their livelihoods. Dhaka, now the capital of Bangladesh, was depopulated.
Do you not think that those atrocities, sorry to interrupt you and forgive me, but when David Cameron went on a visit to Amritsar, he did say, we're dealing with something here that happened a good 40 years before I was born, and the British government rightly condemned it at the time. So do we need to keep atoning and saying sorry for things that happened way, way in the past?
But would you say the same thing to the Chinese and the Koreans who are demanding apologies from the Japanese right now? The fact is, there's hardly anyone alive in Japan who was responsible for any atrocity committed during the Japanese occupation of these countries. But the principle is important. We all remember, I think, of my generation, that historic picture of Willy Brandt on his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. I mean, he was a socialist. He had nothing to do with Nazi crimes. But the fact is, today's Britain was built on the proceeds of its rapacity in India in great part, and not just India, the other colonies as well. You know, the Jane Austen novels and the lifestyle they depicted were made possible by money from the plantations in the Caribbean.
Alison just wanted to come back on one point.
The people of Britain, it seems to me, are living today as the heirs of this iniquity and this colonial exploitation.
Alison,
and therefore they can't really say that they have nothing to do with it. I do agree they don't have to pay for it in a monetary sense.
Okay.
Britain destroyed India through looting, expropriation and outright theft, all conducted in a spirit of deep racism and amoral cynicism. A blistering critique of our colonialist past by a man who was once one of the world's leading diplomats, Shashi Tharoor, now an Indian MP. He's just published his latest book on the iniquities of the British Empire, and its themes have echoes today. Shashi Tharoor is one of India's most outspoken politicians. He's an MP and has been both an ambassador and an Under-Secretary-General of the United Nations. In his latest book, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, Tharoor argues that the British Empire was more about Britain than about India. The great symbols of empire in India, such as the country's rail system, were built for the benefit of the British rather than for Indian citizens. He argues too that colonialism in India was more akin to theft, often leading to death and destruction. In a post-Brexit world, the UK is looking to Commonwealth countries with whom we have had deep historic ties for future trading opportunities, India prime amongst them. Next week's inaugural meeting of Commonwealth trade ministers being held in London is testament to that. In any case, Tharoor judges that in trade talks, the UK will have to be open to discussing allowing more Indian immigrants in, both students and workers.
It is a British problem, first of all, because there is so much historical amnesia about what the empire really entailed. The fact that you don't really teach colonial history in your schools. Children doing A-levels in history don't learn a line of colonial history. There's no real awareness of the atrocities, the fact that Britain financed its industrial revolution and its prosperity from the depredations of empire. The fact that Britain came to one of the richest countries in the world in the early 18th century and reduced it after 200 years of plunder to one of the poorest. But all of that is really not known anymore.
This is difficult stuff because we're just about to try and do a big deal with you. We need your trade. Are you going to hold this against us?
Not at all. I don't really think this is about today's relations, which are between two sovereign equal countries, John. I mean, our economy is as big as yours now. And as far as we're concerned, I think we don't need to have a chip on our shoulder when dealing with you. But I think we do need to be aware of history.
Is this the one? Ah, right, here we go.
Madam President, and gentlemen, ladies of the House, standing here with 8 minutes in my hands and this venerable and rather magnificent institution, I was going to assure you that I belong to the Henry VIII School of Public Speaking. That, as Henry VIII said to his wives, I shall not keep you long. But now finding myself...
Yeah, good one.
But now finding myself the 7th speaker out of 8 in what must already seem a rather long evening to you, I rather feel like Henry VIII's last wife. I more or less know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure how to do it any differently. So revolution was
the thing is, how will he ever know what to compare it to? Because he doesn't know what would have happened if we didn't.
The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world. Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being...
Just told everyone the password.
Was one of
Everyone in the audience there is like, oh, yes, check my email. Really log on.
Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines. The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, when 4 million people died because Winston Churchill, deliberately as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal to sturdy Tommies and Europeans as reserve stockpiles. Yeah. He said that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered much less than that of sturdy Greeks. This is Churchill's actual quote. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him, pointing out that people were dying because of this decision,
that is such a lot of people.
He peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" So all notions that the British were trying
Everyone
to...
likes Winston Churchill, but...
He knows his stuff, doesn't he?
Look through the other notes I was
Very good speaker.
There was
Very
reference to
good.
democracy and rule of law. Let me say with the greatest possible respect.
This is what I hate about like
it's a bit rich
business meetings and stuff, when people laugh at lame jokes, like, but they overcompensate their laugh and laugh really loudly. I just look at them and think it's not even that funny.
You've got to listen so carefully though, because the speed that he speaks, just blown away by how intelligent he is.
Democracy, sir. We had to snatch it, seize it from you. With the greatest reluctance, it was conceded in India's case after 150 years of British rule, and that too with limited franchise. Yes, indeed, ma'am.
The opposition spoke quite highly of Greek and Athenian democracy on which the West should pride itself, and spoke of liberty and equality in that same name. The Athenian democracy was only functioning because of the slave society on which it was built. That's the nature of colonisation.
All right, I don't think that needs contradiction, not from me at any rate.
God, she was a bit eggy, wasn't she? Yeah, how did she get involved?
I think the argument...
Point of interest.
The first speaker, Mr. Lee in particular, conceded all the evil atrocities of colonialism, but for the next 200 years, after the last 200 years of Britain and India. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Very good. What do you think?
Obviously, naturally, I'm going to protect Britain because that's my motherland. That's where I'm from. That's my culture. But I feel like, you know, the saying, like, just picking at the scabs. Like, okay, put hands up, we made a mistake. I'm a great believer in if you've done something wrong, you admit to it, build a bridge, get over it. But I feel like, okay, we made a mistake. Why are you still picking at what happened hundreds of years ago? Like, all of those people are dead. Like, people that Winston Churchill, he's gone. Like, that's not our fault. Don't keep holding us against that. We do, like you mentioned, we send foreign aid out and stuff. But okay, fair enough. The English, like, our government should apologise and all that shiz. But why don't hold that against us now? I agree, it was terrible, like starving the Indians when we were just having the food for backup. That's dreadful. That shouldn't have happened. But please don't hold that against us now. We're completely new. It's unfair.
Wow, what a history lesson that was. I learned so much from that video. So thank you for letting me watch that. That was really educational. There were lots that I didn't know. And wow, we did some bad stuff. and I just was not aware of all that. And of course, we in our schools in the UK, we are not taught that sort of stuff. We're taught about what we did right, not what we did wrong. I have so much more respect for the Indian people now that I've watched that, because, you know, it could have been gone horribly wrong, our relationships with India. So, you know, it's a good thing.
I don't really know too much about it. You don't really get taught this sort of stuff in school.
You can't help when like someone is speaking badly of your, like, of where you come from. You kind of feel a little bit defensive. But like, he's not having a go at British people, he's having a go at colonialism.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like, you can tell he's very peeved. Our generation now and our government now, and in this, like, time now, we've got more important things to worry about than what a country may have done 200 years ago.
What we did was awful and things to India, but as Misha said, our generation and this, we haven't done anything wrong and we shouldn't be owing money for that.
He's very well spoken, put his point across brilliantly. The fact that he wasn't asking for kind of any monetary amount, I think was fair play to him, to be fair. Brought in a lot of good points as well about what the British Empire did and how India suffered within the wars, World War I, World War II. I thought he was talking about World War II to start off with, so it's shocking to hear how much they put in for World War I as well as.
Should we, as modern-day British civilians, feel ashamed of our ancestors' involvement in India?
I don't think we should feel ashamed, because that's not my fault. You should feel ashamed for things you do wrong and that are unacceptable. But we should most definitely be knowledgeable of it. Obviously we took history lessons, but they blinker you on what history they want you to learn about. Obviously World War II, when we won, obviously they're going to want to brag about that. But yeah, we should definitely be more knowledgeable, but not necessarily feel ashamed, because I don't feel it's our wrongdoing in this day and age.
I don't think ashamed is the right word. I don't think you can be ashamed for something you had no control over and no part in. But I think we have to make sure we teach the generations today of what happened. Not even just ourselves, but the whole world should know what's happened everywhere.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that we should be ashamed of it. I think a lot of our ancestors, especially like modern day people like me and you and like low caste citizens or whatever, shouldn't be ashamed, because a lot of our families died and a lot of people died over here and made sacrifices over here as well. So
I don't think we should feel ashamed. I personally don't feel ashamed for what's been done, but I do believe that we can move forwards as together and make it better for everyone, like across the whole world. I mean, it's not just India that we've caused violence to, it's Ireland and everyone else. Every kind of association we've had, except for America, has been with the heel of our boots. So I don't necessarily feel ashamed, but I feel there's a lot that I could do to help better things.
That's got nothing to do with us, so how could we have ever stopped that?
Not anything we've like ever done. Like, it began like 200 years ago, and if we felt bad for everything our ancestors done, then like we'd feel ashamed of like something our grandparents done. Like, can't really live like that. We've got our own things to do, our own people. So
you've got to be careful with the word ashamed, because lots of people have or would have different definitions of the word ashamed. How do you, like you say, how do you owe repentance to India? And I don't think that it should be a certain value attached to it. I think it's just a case of the British people knowing at least what we did to India for us to say, look, we're sorry about what we did.
Why hasn't the British government acknowledged these atrocities and formally apologised?
they're like, you know, let it go.
If I was an Indian, then I would be expecting either Theresa May or even the Queen of the UK really going to India on like a big tour, lots of people know about it, and giving one big speech to say, look, what happened in the past, and doing it almost like the doctor said, you know, going over there and saying sorry.
One of India's most prominent politicians says Britain should atone for plundering his country during colonial rule.
Shashi Tharoor is the Congress Party MP and was in the running to be the United Nations Secretary General at the time Ban Ki-moon won the role. In his book Inglorious Empire, Shashi Tharoor argues that British rule in India was totally amoral and bent on the subjugation of Indians for the purpose of profit. He joined The World earlier.
Good to be with you, Beverly.
You have argued that the British Prime Minister should be on her knees begging for forgiveness for the colonial period. That's not likely to happen. What do you think would be sufficient? What sort of gesture would be sufficient for you?
Well, I do think an apology is due because there's a moral debt. I'm not asking for reparations in sort of the financial sense of the term. But, you know, Britain did come to one of the richest countries on earth, and over 200 years of depredation, exploitation, neglect, managed to reduce it to a poster child for third world poverty. When the British left in that first shambolic Brexit in 1947 with the partition of the subcontinent as a result of their divide and rule policy. And we've managed to recover to a great extent from there, but that doesn't mean that a moral debt isn't owed. And I think that's why, actually, it's not so much the Prime Minister I'd like, I think a member of the royal family, because after all, everything was done in the name of the Crown. Somebody should come and say, look, we're sorry. We've got a perfect occasion coming up. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre reaches its 100th birthday on the 13th of April, 2019. One of the worst atrocities of the Raj, a betrayal of promises made in exchange for which India supported the First World War with men and material and lots of money. The betrayal of those promises, the cruelty of the massacre of unarmed men, women and children in this location in Amritsar, the Jallianwala Bagh, the racism that accompanied it, and then the self-justification. Money was raised to reward the general who ordered the massacre. And Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, called him the man who saved India. And after all of that, surely that would be the perfect occasion to say sorry.
Hey guys, Rocco here. Today's topic is Britain does owe reparations, and I can tell you without even watching this video, of course they do. They probably owe reparations to quite a number of places. But today we're checking out India and why they want their reparations. And Dr. Shashi Tharoor, MP, that's Member of Parliament, I think, not military police, is going to talk us through it. So guys, this is a serious one. As you know, pretty much, you know, Britain or England went around, the English sort of fucked everything back in the day because they could. They were the big guys, you know, so they were treading on people all over the place. So now all they do is sit in their castle. It's like Game of Thrones in real life, really. This is bullshit. All right, guys, let's try not to get fired up straight away. Remember to share this video, you know, get the word out.
Property. I was struck by the fact that your Wi-Fi password at this union commemorates the name of Mr. Gladstone, the great liberal hero. Well, I'm sorry, his family was one of those who benefited from this compensation.
Yeah, and take that. We've all got the password now. Good on you, dog.
Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines.
Sorry to stop it, but I'll just stop it there. This guy, I love this guy, man. He's onto it, eh? Like, and you know how smart that he is, that he can actually incorporate something like that Wi-Fi password that he must have only probably learned just then. Smart, guys. All right, no more stopping.
Actually spends more on fertilizer subsidies, which might be an appropriate metaphor for that argument. If I may point out as well.
Take that, buddy.
If I may point out as well that that as Drake would come after them, that was a legacy of that. Now it's Mugabe will be there, the new sort of Sir Francis Drake of our time. The fact is very simply, sir, that we are not talking about reparations as a tool to empower anybody. They're a tool for you to atone for the wrongs that have been done.
Yeah.
And
it's a way of saying, look, shit, we're not going to do it.
I'm quite prepared to accept the proposition that you can't evaluate, put a monetary sum on the kinds of horrors people have suffered. No. Certainly no amount of money can expiate the loss of a loved one, as somebody pointed out there. You're not going to be able to figure out an exact amount. But the principle is what matters.
Yeah.
The fact
speaking in Great Britain.
At Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
Standing here with President.
Terrible joke since he killed his wife.
And civilization to the benighted heathen. I'm sorry. Churchill's conduct in 43 is simply one example of many that gave a lie to this myth. As others have said on the proposition, violence and racism were the reality of the colonial experience. And no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark. Let me take...
Well, that was a very good speech. As I said, I'm reserving judgment about whether he murdered his wife. I don't know if he did. I don't know
he
enough
murdered that
information
speech.
about-
That was outstanding.
It was a great speech. I will say that in general, as a rule, when speaking of reparations, I am generally opposed to one nation or one people giving reparations to another, because it is usually something that is generations old, and so a current generation is having to pay for the sins of a past generation. So in general, I don't like that idea.
But you said in general.
Yes.
So what is that? Does this mean this is not in general?
No, what I'm saying is I think the idea of reparations as a whole, when you're looking at a current generation paying for the sins of a past generation, is wrong. What he said at the end, I thought made a lot of sense. When you're asking for an apology, I think that's totally different. When you're asking for somebody to look at a nation's history and say, this was wrong, this never should have been done, and even though it wasn't done by our generation, on behalf of those who came before us, we would like to apologize for them. I think that's something that's totally different. I know in our own nation's history, there are some very, very black spots and dark spots on our history, and it's appropriate to say what our ancestors did was wrong, and so we apologize for that. Is it appropriate to say
Welcome to Spotlight on Connected to India. My name is Himanshu Verma. I bring you the special edition of Spotlight from the Delhi residence of Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor will be in Singapore on April 27th for Connected to India's Global Leaders Series.
There is no museum to colonialism, to the imperial experience.
Yeah.
Let's see if they have the courage to create one. And finally, a simple sorry, a simple apology. And I've suggested the perfect time and place as far as India is concerned. And that is that on the 13th of April 2019, a little over a year from now, we will have the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, a horrendous massacre in which Britain started off by betraying the promises it made in return for Indian help in World War I, imposed draconian restrictions, oppressed people. When they started protesting, cracked down with martial law, sent generals, then they shot and massacred peaceful people who had gathered on the occasion of Baisakhi in this walled garden. We won't quarrel about the numbers. The British say 379, our people say 1,600. The truth is somewhere in between, but the fact is that the cruelty and racism that accompanied it, shutting the gates so that even the dead, the dying and the wounded would get no attention for 24 hours, not even a drop of water from their wailing relatives at the gate as these people were dying. Indians were forced to crawl on their bellies on a narrow street, and if they so much as lifted their heads were bashed in. And after all of this, when Dyer was rightly criticized by some, the British conducted a subscription to reward him and gave him the equivalent in today's money of £250,000 together with a bejeweled sword. And Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, called him the man who saved India. Well, I'm sorry, after all of that entire combination, the betrayal, the cruelty, the racism, the indifference to Indian suffering, and the self-justification at the end, perfect thing to come and say, sorry, we were wrong, because they were.
Yeah.
And if they can say that sorry, it may not do very much for us. It'll do a lot for their souls. I think it'll cleanse the British collective soul of this great sin that took place just 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Congress MP Shashi Tharoor took to his social media accounts on May 18th. Thursday to share a sweet story of a British national apologising for Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Tharoor chooses Jallianwala Bagh as a topic of discussion. He recently went to attend the gala of the ongoing Auckland Writers' Festival. Congress MP Shashi Tharoor took to Twitter to share an apology note that read, "I am British born, I am sorry." Sharing the image of the note, Tharoor wrote, "When selected authors were invited to tell a 7-minute true story at the opening gala of the Auckland Writers' Festival, I told the story of Jallianwala Bagh. An Englishman came up afterwards at the book signing and pressed this note into my hand. He received the note after speaking about the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre at a literary festival in Auckland. Hundreds of people were killed when British General Reginald Dyer opened fire at a gathering on Baisakhi at Amritsar's Jallianwala Bagh."
Madam Speaker, we are all facing in 2 months' time the centenary of this absolute horror when in cold blood somewhere between 379 and 2,000 people were mown down by General Dyer and his troops. And it was a cold-blooded imposition of colonial will, Madam Speaker. This was not heat and dust. No one was using violence. These were unarmed men, women and children. They were shot down. This was a great national tragedy, and the fact is it reflected a number of betrayals. The betrayal of the support given by India to the British during the First World War, the betrayal of the promises made of dominion status to our country, the betrayal also of the moral compact that binds those who rule and those who are ruled. It was an act of wanton cruelty. It was a great tragedy in which innocent blood was spilled. And the fact is, Madam, that in December 1919, we had a Congress annual session in Amritsar, presided by Pandit Motilal Nehru, where it was decided that the party should acquire the Jallianwala Bagh in order to build a national memorial. The British tried to block it. They tried to put other things in that site. But in fact, a resolution moved by Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, whom this government has honoured with the Bharat Ratna, he passed a resolution saying the Congress party should take over this site. It was passed in 27 December 1919. And let me quote the words of Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya. He said, "We have decided to raise the memorial, not with any narrow motive, not to keep alive the dark deeds of General Dyer. We want it to be a memorial to the Hindu-Muslim unity that had sprung out of the intermingling of Hindu and Muslim blood on that field of carnage." That this is the same government under which the Sound and Light show in the memorial has been stopped because they have not been giving enough money. They have not given enough money to the memorial. How much money had you given to maintain this memorial that you now want to change the trustees? Mr. Minister, you have to explain, please, where under the Kala Sanskriti Vikas Yojana, where you allot a lot of money to art, culture and other related activities, have you given 1 paise for the Jallianwala Bagh memorial? How can you say now, having reduced this budget, having cancelled the light and sound show, the Sonne Lumiere show, which people came from around the world to see, how can you claim to be defending Jallianwala Bagh? In 2 months' time, it's a centenary. This should be a time for national unity. We should all stand up, remembering the evil atrocities of the colonial empire. We should say we fought for our freedom. We are Indians first. We